Welcome, everyone, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the museum. And today you have a special opportunity to learn from renowned scholar Dr. Marion Kaplan, who will present Lives in Limbo, Jewish Refugees in Portugal, 1940 to 1945. The subject of Jewish refugees who lived in Portugal until they could settle in safer territories abroad is the topic of her book Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, published in 2020. Before we begin, I would like to share a brief introduction of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. And they did this at a time when most people were not yet willing to learn about the Holocaust. And as a result, many survivors did not yet want to talk about it. But thanks to their courage and foresight, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. It is such a privilege to work with scholars like Dr. Kaplan, who will be presenting today's program to help us fulfill our mission. Dr. Kaplan is a Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History Emerita at New York University and the author of several books on the Holocaust era and specifically a few on women in Nazi Germany. She has won 3 National Jewish Book Awards for her authored and edited books and has been a finalist for a 4th book. And her authored books have been translated into German. She's taught modern European, Jewish, and women's history at Queens College and NYU. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Kaplan, for being here. And after the talk, we will have some time for questions from the audience. And you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit a question. Again, thank you very much. And you may begin our program and your presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I will start. I'd like to start with how I came to this topic. I've been writing about the history of German Jews for many years, so that's not new. What is new is the refugee crisis that has had global resonance for all of us in the last several decades. Today, there are about 120 million displaced people, including 44 million refugees, defined as people forced to leave their countries because of persecution, war, or violence. I'm the daughter of German Jewish refugees myself. I began to think about those mostly German and Austrian Jews who had struggled and managed to get out, but not to their final destination. I flew in the Dominican Republic. Then I started wondering, since so many Sassuan Jews had transmigrated from Portugal, how did they get there? What did they do there? And most importantly, how did Jews react emotionally to the sights they encountered during their frightening odysseys and their fearful wait in an oddly peaceful purgatory? So, an emotional history of Jewish refugees biding their time in Portugal may offer us a glimpse into their feelings then, and also into feelings that many refugees on the streets of Paris and Los Angeles, in cafes in Berlin, or under tents in Jordan may share today, no matter how widely divergent their original circumstances. To begin, in the opening scene of Casablanca, and that's PowerPoint number 1, released in 1942, and one of the 5 most popular American films ever, the camera zooms in on a map of Casablanca in relation to Portugal. We learn that the refugees in Casablanca, quote, wait and wait and wait, end quote, for visas to get to Lisbon, the great embarkation point for the freedom of the Americas. At the end of the film, The heroes, however, reached Lisbon via far more tortuous paths, fleeing their homelands and then winding through the Low Countries, France, Spain, and Portugal, arriving destitute and forlorn. Before World War II, about one-third of German Jews fled Germany. Many of those seeking asylum from the Nazis went to neighboring countries, especially France and Holland. Even after the brutality of the Austrian annexation in 1938, very few Jewish refugees from Germany or Austria headed toward Portugal. Most did not even consider Portugal, a very poor agricultural country under another dictatorship. After the shocking violence toward Jews during the 1938 November pogrom, also known as Kristallnacht, in which Nazis burned down close to 300 synagogues and in which over 32,000 Jewish men faced incarceration in concentration camps, German and Austrian Jews urgently tried to flee. However, immigration restrictions in foreign countries stymied many. One refugee wrote, quote, "Every door is firmly locked and bolted, and so is every heart." That same fateful year, Portugal began to issue only 30-day tourist visas to persons who could document that they already had visas and ship tickets to overseas destinations. Many refugees did not have these papers or the requisite money. Still, they came, legally or illegally. Mass flight began with the fall of France in spring 1940. Millions, not only Jews, fled south. That's PowerPoint number 2. Most foreigners, especially Jews, had to get out of France, where the police treated them with a combination of muddle and brutality, sometimes resorting to mass roundups that could end in a concentration camp. Yet leaving France proved treacherous, since the French, now cooperating with Germany, refused to give exit visas. And PowerPoint number 3, you see French refugee children who have just gotten out. Spain's stance on refugees crossing borders also grew increasingly unreliable, making it hard to imagine a crueler way of torturing human beings. So, how research examines the many locations which refugees confronted in their attempts to stay. And also to flee Europe. Here, I focus on only 3 such sites: the borders, refugees nervously crossed; the lines at consulates and aid organizations on which they fretfully waited; and the smoky cafes they uneasily inhabited. These sites triggered emotional reactions, sometimes feelings of anguish, sometimes relief, mostly both. Refugees with and without proper papers faced borders, 4 of them, and that's PowerPoint number 4. They faced these borders with angst and expectations. 2 guards posts were posted between France and Spain, and 2 between Spain and Portugal. Would guards let them through or turn them back? Were their numerous documents sufficient, whether legitimate or forged? At each crossing, anxiety skyrocketed. Quote, borders meant danger. Something could go wrong. Perhaps one didn't have all the papers. Or forged papers could be challenged. German Jew Hans Zahl tensely crossed the border with his, quote, brand new Danish passport, made by one of the best craftsmen in the field. Many refugees faced harsh scrutiny by German patrols, and you can look at PowerPoint number 5. These are border guards at the French-Spanish borders, including some of them being forced to strip completely. Some refugees made the desperate decision to flee France without any papers at all, crossing the Pyrenees Mountains, and avoiding all border guards. That could take between 3 and 10 hours up and a few hours down to Spain. Leia Lazigo, with 2 children and a 3-month-old infant, climbed the Pyrenees on foot in 1943. Portugal demonstrated generosity at first, admitting tens of thousands of transmigrants. By July 1940, Lisbon had emerged as the best way station for Jews to escape Western Europe for North or South America. Between 40,000 and 100,000 people reached Portugal in the years 1940-41, among whom about 90% were Jewish. Most ended up in Lisbon, the capital, and a lively port city of about 600,000, where the majority of Portugal's only 2,000 Jews lived. Portuguese government reluctance and the dizzying visa procedures notwithstanding, Lisbon soon became, quote, the refugee capital of Western Europe. While tens of thousands continued their exodus by boat and some by plane to distant shores, Lisbon still housed about 8,000 refugees in December 1940 and 14,000 in June 41. At that moment, the Nazis directly or indirectly controlled most of Europe, with the exceptions of Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. A few weeks later, 3.9 million Nazi troops invaded the Soviet Union. And in November 1942, a new influx of Jewish refugees appeared in Portugal as Germany invaded Vichy France. Now, I'm going to look at Portuguese citizens' reactions first. Upon successfully arriving in Portugal, refugees had positive experiences with individual Portuguese and remained forever grateful for their kindness. Some arrived with money that would last only days. Others had relatives abroad who might finance their stay, but they had no idea how long they would be there or what it might cost. And most arrived flat broke. And you can turn to PowerPoint 6, refugees at the train station in Lisbon. One woman on a train heading to Lisbon and obviously starving eyed a young girl eating bread. The Portuguese conductor, observing her glance, offered her a whole loaf of bread and gave her a place to lie down in first class. Other refugees, too, report receiving fruit and soup from poor peasants and townspeople upon their arrival in border villages. Jews also noticed the lack of anti-Semitism in the Portuguese population. Moreover, even when Portugal placed restrictions on immigrants, the country still welcomed Jews with capital or businesses. Most Jewish refugees saw Portugal as an interlude and simply tried to get along in the new surroundings. And the Portuguese people proved hospitable to their new customers, tenants, and neighbors. Unlike the generosity and friendliness of Portuguese individuals, however, the government and its dictator, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, that's PowerPoint number 7, who ruled from 1932 until 1968, welcomed only wealthy refugees. Poor refugees had to move on, theoretically in 30 days. Salazar and his minions stressed their neutrality during the war. Yet the warring sides both eyed Portuguese tungsten necessary for military production. Furthermore, Portugal's Azores provided a source of tension. Both the Allies and the Germans hoped to use those islands, located in the North Atlantic, for air and naval operations. Ultimately, and pretty late, Portugal tipped toward the Allies. Strategic and economic issues certainly influenced Portuguese hesitations regarding refugees, but Portuguese leaders also worried about domestic issues. Some thought that the small country could not absorb huge numbers of immigrants, seeing themselves as a land of emigration, not immigration, losing about 50,000 people a year due to their poor economy. Most importantly, Salazar and his cronies feared all aliens, Jewish and non-Jewish, as possible liberals and leftists who might destabilize the regime. Significantly, Salazar did not evince anti-Semitism. For him, citizenship meant political and legal status. It wasn't a racial category. Portuguese Jews were simply Portuguese. He did not openly discuss Jews nor use terms like Judeo-Bolshevik or world Jewry as other European fascists did. Even Portuguese fascists who admired Hitler did not oppose Jews entering Portugal to escape his violence. The police certainly harbored anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic attitudes. But even as they harassed and threatened Jews, we know of few incidents where the police delivered them to the Germans. Individual Portuguese consuls also came to the aid of refugees. Against the desires of his government, Portugal's general consul in Bordeaux, France, and this is PowerPoint number 8, Aristides de Souza Mendes, wrote out at least 10,000, some count far more, visas for refugees, both Jewish and non-Jewish, from every part of Europe. Sousa Mendes issued so many visas that his government sent 2 officials from Lisbon to bring him home and severely punished him. But his very lucky recipients went on to Lisbon. Now, once having arrived, how did they make ends meet? And this is really the body of my own research. First, I want to talk about local and international helpers. As mentioned, the majority of refugees came without much or any money. As it ran out, many needed subsidies for their rent and food bills. Moreover, those relatives and friends caught in the Nazi trap besieged these same penniless refugees for support. Some families occupied small apartments or had cooking facilities in their rooms. One interviewee remembered many versions of sardine dinners, quote, because that was the main affordable food. Those without sufficient income or who stayed in rooms without hot plates trekked up the Lisbon hills at noon to receive a free hot lunch from the Portuguese Jewish community soup kitchen. That's PowerPoint number 9. This soup kitchen was subsidized by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC. Many, maybe most Jewish refugees depended on subsidies from local and international organizations, especially the Jewish ones. The Jewish ones, HIAS, HISAM, the JDC, the World Jewish Congress, and the Portuguese Jewish Relief Committee supported refugees in a spirit of solidarity with Jews in trouble, but also to prevent them from burdening the state. The Quakers, the Catholic Relief Services, and the Unitarian Service Committee, among others, helped non-Jewish refugees, but often Jews as well. All of these aid groups also attempted to find visas and ship passage for refugees, especially to the United States. As people on the ground felt then, and as historians have since verified, the United States State Department created a cumbersome process. In part, its leadership worried about depression-induced fear of job competition, as well as what they called fifth columnists or Trojan horses, supposedly Nazi agents who might sneak into the US among the refugees. In addition, attempts to persuade the US administration and elected representatives to welcome more refugees, quote, ran into the stone wall of anti-Semitism. Severe entrance limitations and excruciatingly slow application processing reduced immigration to a crawl, not unsimilar to today in the United States. So how did refugees react to this situation? The answer? They stood on lines, lines, and more lines. Forced to engage in what they called a paper chase, refugees spent anxious moments on lines at the post office, at aid organizations, and at consulates. A repetitive schedule of errands demanded time and attention. The Peccolis couple, that's PowerPoint number 10, having fled Italy, passed long days engaging in the anxious rituals of refugee life, pursuing documents to secure their safety. This meant lining up at police headquarters for permission to remain in Portugal and at consulates for visas to get out of Portugal. In order to acquire proper papers, Carla Peccolis and her husband turned their Lisbon room into an office. While Alex went out to, quote, visit consulates, police commissioners, travel agencies, in search of a million things, proof citizenship, quote, end quote, Carla pounded out letters on the typewriter addressed to friends and relatives, especially in New York, with requests that went from a simple testimonial off it that would place the responsibility for their future on the shoulders of whomever acted as a guarantor. Refugees seeking visitors' extensions or visas waited on endless lines wherever they went. Erica Mann, that's the daughter of Thomas Mann, on a short trip to Lisbon from England in the fall of 1940, had to appear at the police officer for foreigners. She walked 8 minutes to the end of the line, and she thought the line at the American embassy had no end at all. Carla Peccolis summed up, while waiting, refugees faced, quote, a jungle of consulates, police stations, and government offices, bureaucratic red tape, loneliness, homesickness, and withering universal indifference. She concluded, again a quote, it would have taken the pen of a Kafka to depict the world of visas in all its surrealistic absurdity, that of a Dostoevsky to render the nightmare of the petitioner's struggle for survival. In the end, the refugees had only one occupation: waiting, waiting, and waiting. So we went from lines, lines, lines to waiting, waiting, and waiting. These consulate lines heightened anxiety, frustration, and often dejection. Many refugees, like Annie Corey's parents, waited on lines, quote, for visas to go anywhere. Countless began to feel that no country wanted them. Black humor made the point. A refugee enters a travel agency and says he'd like to go to any country in the world. The agent brings out a globe, and the customer studies it carefully, finally asking, is that all you have to offer? Besides lining up for police and consulates, most refugees also waited at aid agencies. Daily interactions with these organizations provided relief and exasperation. The refugees themselves understood that American Jewish organizations offered a lifeline. Hans Saal wrote that they paid their hotel or boarding house, the food they ate, the doctors they needed, and, quote, the pills for anxiety and sleeplessness. Gratefulness, however, clashed with frustration, similar to the resentment and mistrust that often complicates relations between social welfare organizations and their recipients. Refugees had suffered drastic economic and social decline. Hannah Arendt saw parables of increasing self-loss. She explained, quote, we lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in the world. And she continued, once we were somebodies about whom people cared. We were loved by friends and even known by landlords as paying our rent regularly. She described a frustrated middle-aged man who had appeared before countless aid committees, quote, in order to be saved. At one aid organization, his emotions triggered an exasperated exclamation. "Nobody here knows who I am," he shouted. Nobody knew who he had been, or the kind of people he had come from, or the heights from which he had dropped. In despair, he realized he could not overcome the gap between how others saw him and how he wished to be seen. These refugees, much like so many today, had become Arendt's, quote, new kind of human beings, the kind that are put in concentration camps by their foes and in internment camps by their friends. When the refugees finished their visits to consulates, aid organizations, and shipping offices, they often headed to the central square, the Rocio, and that's PowerPoint number 11, to sit in cafes, a kind of diasporic homeland. This new transnational and temporary home offered a site where, quote, one heard more German and French than Portuguese. Some, like the Cafe Palladium, seemed filled with refugees. Lisbon cafes no longer simple sites of sociability, although they may have been a pleasant byproduct, offered indispensable locations in which to share advice and rumors. The rumors were known as the refugee telegraph about the war and about possible places where they were giving out visas. Conversations circled around various consulates and aid committees to which individuals had appealed. This liminal world of cafe identities allowed most Jews a semblance of normalcy, a place to remember who they once were and feel recognized by others from their previous worlds. Stretching a cup of coffee for hours, women and men found solace among people in the same situation. Many faced the same psychic hell, worrying about family and friends left behind, mourning the loss of their homes, positions, and reputations, and fearing the process of starting all over again in a new place with a new language and new rules. By sharing angst and empathy, cafe patrons bonded. Yet they were also rivals enveloped in their own misery. They depended on one another for friendship and support, but they also competed for scarce visas and insufficient space on ships. Sharing hope, they needed to repress envy when someone else succeeded. When one woman received her American visa, the cafe in which she passed her days first erupted in a flurry of questions. What kind is it? A visa to immigrate or an emergency visa? Where'd you get it? Certainly not here. When do you leave? Despite their companionship, these cafes also did not provide freedom from danger, since occasionally the police swooped down on these cafes and arrested individuals with inadequate papers. And if you've seen Casablanca, you know that's the first scene where the police come in and start to grab the refugees. Moreover, rumors increased nervousness. One family heard, quote, partly in jest, partly in earnest, that Germany would take Spain in a day and capture Portugal by telephone. From Pearl Harbor until war's end, refugees remained in limbo, confronting more lines at consulates and police stations. Visas ran out. Many faced quasi-incarceration in small villages, locations that the Portuguese government called fixed residences. They could only leave these villages with special permission, but they often needed to travel to Lisbon to get the necessary papers and tickets. One social worker observed that the refugees lived, quote, in a hiatus, rather like a patient with an unknown disease who waits anxiously for an unknowable diagnosis. Arthur Koestler put it more dramatically, quote, they were all escaping from the past and striving for some safe shore of the future. the present in which they lived was a no man's land between the two. In conclusion, those refugees lucky enough to jump the myriad hurdles between their country of origin and the Portuguese coastline had suffered enormous physical and mental anguish. En route to Portugal, and often penniless, many searched for food, shelter, and for visas. They crossed terrifying borders, lined up at exasperating consulates for increasingly unattainable visas, and at aid organizations for support that most of these formerly middle-class people had never required. And they sat in cafes, those, quote, meeting places of refugees from all over the world, exchanging rumors, vying for visas, and consoling each other. Ambivalently and ambiguously, Portugal, a poor country whose dictatorial government feared foreigners and leftists, offered a relatively safe haven to refugees. Its rich and poor extended solace and support and left strong positive impressions with the Jewish sojourners. Lisbon emerged as a symbol of temporality and transition, and Portugal ultimately saved the lives of tens of thousands of Jews who managed to get there. Despite vast contrasts in time, place, religion, ethnicity, and regimes, refugees share similarities, especially their feelings about being forced to flee homes and loved ones while waiting for the world to react. No one flees home unless they have to. As Warsan Shire, the first young poet laureate for London, put it, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. No one puts their children on a boat unless water is safer than land. During World War II, Jews, and more recently, Middle Easterners, Africans, and Central South Americans have fled their homes and histories while begging strangers for kindness. Even if each refugee crisis is historically specific, studying refugees' feelings helps transform statistics into people. As the US Supreme Court put it in 1977, quote, individuals who testified about their personal experiences brought the cold numbers to life. Paying careful attention to the words of refugees in Portugal may help us to understand Jewish heartbreak and perseverance in the 1940s, and also to listen compassionately to refugee stories in our own time. Do I have enough time to give one personal story
Yes.
from one of the people who saw as who I whose interview I read? Good.
Yes, you do.
I would like to leave you with one. Okay, I would like to leave you with one individual experience. Since many of the Jewish refugees were children, and over half of today's refugees are children, this is the story of Annette Scher. Without required papers or money, some refugees walked through Spain. In 1942, it took 11-year-old Annette and her parents 3 months to do so. One cold night, as they tried to sleep in yet another barn, warmed by the breath of cows, she realized it was December and began to cry. She declared, it must be Hanukkah, and we have no menorah, the traditional candelabra. This moment turned into a lasting memory when her father responded, what do you mean we don't have a menorah? We have the most beautiful menorah in the world. Opening the barn door a crack, he said, pick out the shiniest star. That will be the shamas, the candle that lit the others. Now find the other candles. So I found 4 on each side, and we lit a menorah in the sky. This may have been the one bright spot in her wanderings. 50 years after her odyssey, Annette Scher admitted, quote, I felt I was on borrowed time since I was 10. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much for sharing your research with us, and especially that last story that you were so fortunate to learn firsthand. We do have some questions, and again, if anybody has questions, please use the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. The first question is, did some Jews choose to remain in Portugal, and did any others choose to live in Portuguese colonies?
It's a very good question. Very few Jews chose to stay in Portugal, but some of the younger people actually met partners there and married. So I would say 2 dozen at least. And there are Portuguese, German Jewish, Portuguese, Austrian Jewish families in Portugal today, or today they'd be the grandchildren. Did any of them choose to live in the colonies? No, because Salazar did not allow refugees into his colonies. So he let them into the mainland and wanted to whisk them off, but he did not let them into the colonies.
You, do you feel like the story of the Jews who settled in Portugal during this time is lesser known than other places? And if so, why do you think this is not something that was so widely learned or so widely discussed?
I think it's because there were so few. There's a very nice film called Under Blue Skies, but it's in German. um, that interviews some of those people who stayed, done by the grandson of one of these couples. Um, but very few stayed, so it isn't a big story. There's another film coming out very soon as well uh, about a Jewish man who went to Portugal, stayed in Portugal for a while, and then wound up in Latin America. His son is making a film about it, but he left. This is not a Jewish man who stayed.
Thank you. Why did it take the Portuguese government so long to commute Sousa Mendes' sentence for writing the visas for stateless Jews, which they did in 1988?
Well, I mean, first of all, Salazar left in 1968. And then I think what really made a difference was the pressure by American groups, American Jewish groups, many of whom were the children uh, mostly the children of people who had gotten Sousa Mendes visas. And I have a feeling that that played a role. Sousa Mendes had something like 13 children, and they also all wound up in the United States. There was no one really of the family left to pressure the government. So it really came from outside. And I think it mostly came from the children of people who had been saved by him.
Thank you so much. And on this a similar subject, there were so many people who he saved, some of whom ended up becoming quite well known throughout the world. Are you able to share a few of those people with us, a few of those names?
I'm not so sure of that. He didn't save Hannah Arendt. He didn't save some of the well-known people. He saved a rabbi, and the rabbi saved many kids from a yeshiva. I don't remember his name. Um, but I don't know of many well-known people. Maybe the person who asked the question can tell us.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, that we will see if we have this later on. Another question is, how many Jews
Yeah.
lived in Portugal at the beginning of the war, and how many were saved?
Okay, so the beginning of the war, maybe around 3,000, under 3,000 Jews lived. They were Portuguese Jews, lived in Portugal, 2,000 in Lisbon. Um, and how many were saved? Good question. I say between 40,000 and 100,000. Now that's a humongous gap, but we really don't know because there were a lot of illegal entries. Uh, People were smuggled in. I always give smugglers a good name because that saved a lot of Jewish lives. Um, and so it's not clear how many, but I would say somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 got in and got out, and I would consider that having saved them.
Thank you so much. And we have a comment here that it was Hans and Margaret Ray, the couple who wrote Curious George, were saved by D'Souza Mendez.
Okay, I didn't know that. I know that they took their bicycle through France and that Curious George is a little refugee. I did know that, but I didn't know that they were saved by Susan Mendez. That's very nice to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, when you were doing your research on this for this book and this topic, how many survivors from who actually lived in Portugal did you have the opportunity to meet or speak with?
A handful. A lot of the material that I have is from the Shoah Foundation in LA, from the Holocaust, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, from the Fortunoff archives. So it was good for me that people had the foresight, as you were describing the Holocaust Museum that you're working in, the foresight to ask people for interviews. So most of them, but I did meet a few wonderful people um, who had been in Portugal. In fact, I had worked at the Leo Beck Institute, which is a library and archive in German Jewish, Austrian Jewish history. And I had met a man there who was a volunteer, an older man who was a volunteer. And when I started going through my research, I found his letters to his family in America. He was stuck in Portugal. And I met his son. He had long since passed away, but I met his son who gave me more information. So it was really quite wonderful to meet up with someone whom I had really known and who had written all these really frantic letters in the 1940s, early 40s, because he couldn't seem to get to the United States because the State Department was putting block after block after block in front of him so that he had to jump over hoops. And finally, he did get in.
Thank you. Do you know if there were, if any were there on Brazilian visas, thanks to the Polish consul general in Istanbul, who created phony baptism certificates, which allowed Jews access to visas intended only for Catholics?
Right. I know about that, but I've never been able to count how many there were. But yes, I've heard of that. I have never come across someone who said, "Oh, and I had a fake visa as a Catholic." I have not come across that. But I should say that when I already said that the Quakers and the Unitarians took care of non-Jews, but also took care of Jews. Why? Because the Jewish organizations did not take care of Jewish converts. So Jewish converts were taken care of by the non-Jewish organizations. And I suspect that these people with Catholic visas or Catholic IDs would not have gone to the Jewish organizations.
You. Um, was there any artwork that may have been taken from by the Nazis from families?
I'd say the answer to that is yes, but I don't know of any specific example of those who went through Portugal. I know that Peggy Guggenheim went through Portugal and was carrying some art with her. So the Nazis didn't get that. Um, but it's well known that the Nazis stole art, and there's still a lot of debate to this day about from families wanting to get their family's artwork back, and their artwork is in European museums that don't want to give it back. So there's a lot of that.
You and I, you mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but what sparked your interest in the Portugal story and specifically the community here in Portugal of all the places?
It was basically because when I did my work on the Dominican Republic, so many of them came from Portugal. And I didn't understand why Portugal. What's going on? Most of them, I would have guessed, would have come from Germany and Austria. Well, they did. They came from Germany and Austria via France, via Spain, via Portugal. So I did a little detective work and I found out that Portugal was a huge uh, port for people leaving for the North and South America. So it was just basically working backwards.
Do you know where most of the refugees in Portugal ended up going?
North and South America, mostly United States, but Argentina, Brazil as well, and Sosua as well, Dominican Republic as well. So I think all of the above.
Thank you. I'm just reading here for. And what percentage of those were thanks to D'Souza Mendes?
Well, we don't know. The kind of hard statistics are 10,000, but the organizations of children and grandchildren who were saved by Sousa Mendes, they argue it's closer to 30,000. So I really don't know. It's somewhere between, I would say. And he suffered terribly. He wound up going to the kitchen that you showed to the viewers, that public kitchen. He was there because he didn't have food. So he really suffered terribly, and his children suffered. And he was a hero.
You and can you please remind everyone the title of your book about this subject?
Let me get it. Then I can show the picture too. It's called Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal. And one of the things at the beginning of this talk, I'm looking at people's feelings as well as what they did. I'm really interested in how refugees feel, how people escaping danger and winding up in limbo, how they feel, how they navigate these moments of their lives. I should add one other thing, which is we read a lot about what happened in the Holocaust. And we are reading quite a bit now about making new lives. I came to America and this is what happened, or I came to Brazil and this is what happened. And it was that liminal space, that Lisbon space that interested me, like how'd they get there? How'd they get out of there? And so that's why I started to research this particular project.
Did you have difficulty finding accounts specifically about these feelings, as you mentioned? Or were a lot of the testimonies that you listened to, with a lot of them just really chronicling how they got from point A to point B and without really going into detail about their feelings from a day-to-day basis?
That's a very important question. So, in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, there's a new historical approach called the history of emotions. And I've read a lot about it. I've been very interested in it. And I was trained to basically tell a story of what people did, not to tell a story about how people felt. And this history of emotions gave me the opportunity to read with different eyes. They all talk about their feelings. It's just that I never paid attention to that because we were taught it's what people do. In one of my books, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, I even say this is about what they did, not what they felt. And now I look at that book and I think, this is silly. Of course, it was also what they felt. And so I was very interested, and it's very easy to find feelings of people who are wandering through different lands and who are standing on lines and waiting and waiting and waiting, who get turned down by grumpy or nasty consuls because they didn't fill out one line that needed to be filled out, who go line up for blocks and blocks at a shipping agency only to be told that there are no ships for the next 3 months. So I think I was very interested in that, and it also helped me think about feelings of refugees today. They're coming to a strange place, they're escaping from somewhere, and they don't know where they're going. So it's really, for me, it's important to understand how the Holocaust impacted the Jewish refugees, but also kind of opened doors for me to see how other refugees, today's refugees, have to deal with all kinds of issues. So it's both.
Thank you so much. And so um, as a clarification, is your interest in the subject of Portugal as relating to the Holocaust and the Jewish community there is about the Jewish refugees and not so much about Jewish life in Portugal before the Holocaust. Is this correct?
That's correct. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about it. Jews were middle-class business people in Portugal. Many of them supported Salazar, so many of them were fascists. Same in Italy. One-third of Jews in Italy were fascists. They supported Mussolini. And they walked on tenterhooks to be careful not to annoy the dictator in terms of too many refugees coming in, or too many refugees if they were seen begging, for example. The Jewish organizations wanted to make sure that Jews were very proper and didn't cause any problems. And the government was pretty good. I mean, the government did arrest people, put them in these things that called fixed residences. They called them fixed residences, put some in jail, but only for some days here and there. The Jewish community got them out. And I should add one other thing. I said Salazar was a PhD in economics. He thought Hitler was out of his mind. He did not believe in racism. I did say that. What I didn't say is that he never married, he didn't have many friends, and his best friend was the head of the Jewish community in Lisbon, who had gone to college with him. They were university friends. So I think and Moses Amzalek, that was the head of the Jewish community, played a big role also in intervening when things got a little rough for refugees in Lisbon, when the police were a little bit too animated and too nasty. I think Amzalek played a role there too.
Thank you. And I'm wondering to conclude if there's another story that comes to mind about a refugee, maybe a refugee family that was in Portugal, just something that you remember standing out to you during your research. You concluded your speech with one story. Is there one more you can off the top of your head that you'll be able to share with us?
Well, it's not a long story, two short stories, and they're about generational differences. So one story is about a Berlin banker and his wife who had never worked outside the house, and their two children. And the children, they had been through France, they had been through the Low Countries, they had then gotten to Portugal, and the kids had picked up languages. They got Jewish refugees were not allowed to have jobs in Portugal. They were not allowed to take jobs away from the Portuguese. But these teenagers got jobs with the Joint Distribution Committee to translate. Why? Because sadly, Americans don't know languages. And so all of those nice Americans who went over there to help the Jews didn't know Portuguese and didn't know any other languages. So these kids earned a good living by translating for the joint people. The girl, then a later teenager, maybe 15, 16, had a boyfriend who was Portuguese. And her father puffed and puffed and said, "You can't do that. You know, you can't go out with that person." And it wasn't appropriate for him. And she basically told him, "No, I can do whatever I want. I'm earning the money." And where did I find that story? In one of the Quaker um, uh, social worker files at the Holocaust Museum. And the other story is a young woman again with her mom, and her mom had always taken care of her. By the time they escaped from Prague to Paris to Spain to Portugal, she was taking care of her mother. Her mother couldn't do it anymore. Her mother was terrified. Her mother had lost the wherewithal to talk to police and to talk to guards and to talk to bankers. And she, picking up languages also, she's another one who dated Portuguese boys, picked up languages, and she was able to help herself and her mother to survive in Lisbon until they got out. So I think the generational differences were amazing. The older generations lost their status, they lost their homes, they lost everything. And the younger generations, many of them saw it as an adventure, a new land, a new country, a place where Nazis weren't harassing them or hurting them. It was a feeling of freedom for a lot of the younger people. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you again so much for sharing your research with us. And again, I want to thank everybody so much for tuning in today. And just, I wanted to actually conclude just with, again, with a clearer photo of Dr. Kaplan's book on this subject. So it's Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, and you can find it online or possibly in your bookstore. But again, I want to thank you so much for doing this with us. And I also want to just remind our audience that Holocaust Museum LA will be closed for a period of some months for our construction beginning in August through spring of 2026, at which point we will be to open our new building as our museum has been expanding for a few years, and we'll be having a lot of programs like these online in the meantime. So please follow our website because we will be putting together programs and lectures by scholars who live all over the country and, in fact, in different places of the world as well. And we will be doing a series as well about Holocaust survivor communities that established in different countries, for example, Mexico, Sweden, South Africa. And this is something we're fortunate to be doing online with scholars from those countries while we're closed. So again, we appreciate so much everyone's attention here. And again, Dr. Kaplan, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Wishing everybody a good rest of the week ahead. Thank you.
Bye-bye.